WNST on. He's been in the cave somewhere over the last 18 to 24 months writing this book that I now have in my hands. It is Football for a Buck. He is a New York Times best-selling author and a longtime sports journalist. We welcome Jeff Pearlman onto the program. You can follow his journey on Twitter at Jeff Pearlman, and you certainly can pick up the book. It's not a buck. It's a few more bucks than a buck, but it is Football for a Buck. And Jeff, first off, I follow you on Twitter. I followed your career as a guy who's tried to tell the truth in Baltimore. I appreciate your work over all this time. But a book on the USFL, I'm sure the publishers thought this was a great idea, right?
I would say that did not bring back joy to anyone. They were genuinely confused why I wanted to write a book about the USFL. It took me 10 years to get a book deal. I had to beg and plead and beg. I took less money. It was like, what the hell do you want to write a USFL book? But I knew it was a great subject. I knew it was a great book. So I just went with it.
Did you know this was a great book before the orange guy became president, or is that something that sort of spurred this on? Because as much as this is a story about the USFL, this is really about the story about a jerk who became president 33 years later, or whatever the number has been. And certainly I've had some guys that have played for the New Jersey Generals back in the day. But this league was killed by Donald Trump, right?
Yeah, but I don't view it as a Trump book. And I'm not just saying this. I pitched it way before he was. Where it would be preposterous, the idea of him as president. But it's totally true. He ruined the league. It was out of greed and selfishness and sort of a desire to get in the NFL. So it started out just as a book and kind of ended up in many ways as this is what happened 30 years before he was president. He was kind of ruined this 30 years ago, too.
Well, it's interesting to me because I lived through it, right? I mean, the Baltimore Stars, who never played in Baltimore, which I'm sure is outlined in your book. I was working at the News American and at the Baltimore Sun as the kid at the end of the agate desk when John Stedman would come back from College Park and see the Baltimore Stars take on the San Antonio Gunslingers. And I remember him walking in and say, "Senor, I saw the worst quarterbacking performance of my lifetime." And I said, "Who was that?" He said, "Rick Neuheisel." And, of course, I tell Neuheisel that story now, and he loves it, 35 years later. But those were the kinds of stories with Jim Kelly and Herschel Walker and Donald Trump and real football players that we're aware of, Steve Young, and what that league did. And I guess for those of us who were our age, who were maybe kids at that time, that maybe put the television on in the spring on a date night like I did at that point, and knowing that the league went away. I remember being in Jamaica when the story came out that they got $1 for the settlement because there was some consternation about the NFL maybe being, against the law at that point, or maybe the USFL would get more of a judgment than they got. But the whole thing is a bit of a comedy, but it's not a comedy to the people that were involved in it, whose lives got swirled up in it back in the 80s, right?
No, people love the USFL. And it's funny, you just said it, but the league was just crazy. Like, that's the biggest joy of it. It was absolutely insane. The Baltimore Stars moved from Philadelphia because the league decided to move to Fall, so they lost their lease to the vet. So they decided to move to Baltimore. Only Edward Bennett Williams didn't want football in the stadium, so they play in College Park, but they're named Baltimore. But the only thing they have to do with Baltimore is once a week the head coach, Jim Mora, would take the train down to Baltimore to hold a press conference with the Baltimore media who are covering the Baltimore Stars, but not in Baltimore. The San Antonio Gunslingers, as you mentioned, Rick Neuheisel was their quarterback. They were absolutely terrible. The owner stopped paying bills. Their star defensive lineman chased the owner with a bat to get his money. They played on a field where they painted it with industrial strength paint instead of paint that you're supposed to use on a field. So players are getting all these injuries where paints are getting in their cuts. I mean, the whole league, a team was traded for another team. Chicago was traded for Arizona, where all the players in Arizona were sent to Chicago. All the players from Chicago were sent to Arizona. The general manager of the Chicago Blitz locked himself in his office after he was fired and called the media to tell him what a disaster it is. I mean, a member of the San Antonio Gunslingers was put on the disabled list because he got his penis caught in the trunk. Like,
whoa. This is AM radio. We need to talk more about this. Penis stuck in a trunk? What? Huh?
Yeah. So it was reported to the league as a groin injury. But
I would say a major groin injury.
It's a major groin. It was not a car trunk. It was an equipment trunk in the team in the locker room, and he was slamming the trunk, and it slammed on his penis. So
I'm thinking he was doubtful that week, right?
Yeah, he was. He did not play. So it was. it's just the USFL was this crazy collection of nonsense. And writing the book, I didn't know 1/100th of it. So it really was a joy to report. It was just a different level of stuff.
Well, I would say that that's my case. I've written 4 books, and I know you've written a whole bunch as well, that you have this idea, and it's crazy middle of the night, and it's always on a gum wrapper or a pay stub or a cocktail napkin after the 3rd cocktail or whatever, and you're like, this is a good idea. The USFL thing, like, I see it as a great storytelling thing. And look, Terry Pluto's a pal of mine from Cleveland, wrote a book on the ABA. It's one of my favorite books, you know. I like sort of these offbeat books. I think my favorite book of all time is Seasons in Hell, Shropshire writing about the Texas Rangers and Ted Williams. And I mean, those teams there's nothing luminary about them. They didn't win games. They were just a fun story to tell. The USFL is something that rose up much like the XFL and like whatever this thing Phil Savage is doing right now that's trying to compete with. People have been trying to compete with the NFL since the AFL, and now the NFL has such enormity to it that these other stories go by the side of the wayside. For you with this story, though, what was the linchpin to making it happen for you that you felt like you needed to write it? Because it is a collection of oddball stories, but I guess 35 years later, there's a president of the United States of America who was involved in incinerating this thing. So I guess that makes it a much more viable story and a much more better book for you to sell in 2018 than maybe it was in 2014, let's say.
Well, it's interesting because when I got the deal, the publishing house, Houghton Mifflin, and they would admit this, they were like, they were giving it to me almost like throwing me a bone because I wrote Brett Favre's biography and it did really well. And when Trump became president, you know, the publishing house was like, holy crap, like this book just moved up our ranks in huge ways. So it definitely changed the trajectory of the book and mainly it changed how you promote it more than anything. You know, Trump ruined the league. That's a fact. Trump was a poisonous, toxic presence in the USFL. That is a fact. But all of a sudden you're promoting a book and you're not just going on sports talk radio. You're trying to get on MSNBC and CNN because, you know, with him, I just think there's a ton to learn from what he did in the USFL and sort of the greed and the narcissism. And I'm sure you have listeners who love Donald Trump. It's very hard to study the USFL and love Donald Trump because you see what he did to that league just so he could get an NFL franchise. And by the end of research, to be totally honest, and at least it's based on experience, it's not based on leanings, I couldn't stand him because I couldn't believe how little he cared about the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in the USFL who this is their dream come true. I mean, these are, you know this, most of these guys were not Jim Kelly and Steve Young. Most of these guys were the defensive tackle from UMBC or Delaware or Lehigh who were a little too small or a little too slow or under-scouted, and they're living their football dream. And when he did that, you probably saw the 30 for 30 small potatoes. When he called the USFL small potatoes, I mean, so many of these guys were livid because this was their opportunity to play pro football. And for him to just be like, yeah, I ruined it, but I don't really care. I just moved on. Really freaking hit people in the gut.
Who lost a lot of money? You know, I've had the Doug Flutys and the Herschel Walkers on the show. I mean, I've dug on all the time. And, you know, the people that were involved, Dave Lapham also played for the New Jersey Generals in Cincinnati. Yeah. So it's not hard for you to find people with stories, and nothing's better than the John Bassett letter to Trump, right? Like that's famously circulated, and I've retweeted that a few times to help you sell football for a buck, Pearlman. But on top of that, the stories, the tales that go taller on down the line, these people all want to talk about it, but I don't know who really got screwed. I'm just a guy that watched it on ABC for a couple of springs. I never bought a ticket. I think I have a few press credentials floating around that Ken Murray or Vito Stellino or John Stedman slid me back in the 80s. So I probably have a few souvenirs from it, but it didn't cost me anything. A lot of the players got paid. Some of them got screwed on some of the money, but they got paid some of the money. Who really lost their ass on the USFL?
Well, a bunch of owners who really lost their money, mostly guys you haven't heard of, but almost no teams made money. The Denver Gold made a little money. John Bassett, the Tampa Bay Bandits, came out a little below even. Donald Trump lost a ton of money, but he could. Al Taubman, who owned the Stars, who ultimately were the Baltimore Stars, lost a lot of money, but he could. T. William Oldenburg of the LA Express lost all his money. The owner of the San Antonio Gunslingers lost all his money, but these were guys who were losing their money in different avenues, no one lost their fortunes in the USFL. But very few people made money. And there were no players who went bankrupt because, if anything, players made a little money off of it. Most of them got paid except for the gunslinger players. Most of these guys wound up getting most of their money.
Is there anybody out there, by the way, Jeff Pearlman joining us here. I want to reset everything. Jeff, of course, longtime sports writer, author, and a pal of ours from the road. Football for a Buck is the book, The Crazy Rise and Crazier Demise of the USFL. I've waited a long time to have Jeff on because he's been busy writing. How many pages here? 360 pages of USFL lore. And, this area, we didn't have a team. I mean, famously, all this happened right around the same time that the Baltimore Colts became the Indianapolis Colts and the Baltimore Stars and sticking their name on all of that. For all of this that happened back in the day, are there a handful of people who still believe that this could have worked? I never thought it was going to work, but I was a 15, 16-year-old kid. I thought football in the spring was kind of silly. I thought competing in the fall was even sillier. I thought it was somewhere between the CFL and the NFL, and maybe it could have been another AFL. But is there anybody out there that really thought this thing was viable, even 35 years later, to make a case that this could have, should have, would have been a contender?
Yeah, actually, you find a lot of guys who think, and I agree with this. I'm not saying it would have lasted. It's a very hard, it's a long shot under any circumstances. But the original plan for the USFL of spring football, of keeping payrolls down, sort of an alternative league. There's a big gap in spring when not that much is going on in sports. Regional drafts, like the Philadelphia Stars were getting guys from Penn State and Pitt, and the Tampa Bay Bandits were getting guys from Florida and Florida State. The idea itself, I think, was a very workable idea. Doesn't mean the USFL would have lasted because guys were spending way too much money, but I think the idea itself was legit. I think it could have worked. Steve Young said to me recently, he was like, it breaks my heart. They should be playing spring football right now. The USFL should still be in spring. I don't know if that's realistic, but, guys feel that way.
Jeff Pearlman is our guest. You can follow him out on Twitter as well. He's out promoting Football for a Buck and the USFL. How does this relate to the current NFL? And I guess the Trump Buffalo story and the Trump knee story goes on, and I'll let you put those pieces together. We're aligned politically on all of this, I believe, from your Twitter. But I think the fascinating upshot of this is 35 years later, this clown became the president of the United States. But more than that, really hates the NFL, even though he wants to be a part of it, right? I mean, and wanted to own a team so badly, and the punitive nature of how he feels about the NFL has borne itself out into the knee 3.5 decades later.
Look at it this way. He tried buying the Baltimore Colts and failed. He tried getting a USFL, NFL franchise by meeting with Pete Rozelle, failed. He tried suing the NFL and failed. He tried buying the Dallas Cowboys and failed. He tried buying the New England Patriots and failed. He tried buying the Buffalo Bills and failed. When he was an owner in the USFL, he used to hold meetings all the time during the national anthem where he'd be talking on the phone. It's all nonsense. It's all just bluster. I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat. There's no way you can look at this and think, he's really a patriot trying to fight for blah, blah, blah. It's such a joke and such a wedge issue. It just drives me freaking crazy. It's nonsense.
Well, it probably drives Colin Kaepernick crazy, too, that, 3.5 decades later, this guy that killed the USFL has put his teeth in on Twitter to try to go after the NFL, clearly damaged my franchise last year, where half the seats are empty and half the seats are full. That still lingers on. Colin Kaepernick doesn't have a job, but he still wants to, in his mind's eye, when he's done being president, he'll own the New York Giants, right? Like, literally, Rozelle told him 3 decades ago, right? Like, literally, Rozelle had this famous one-on-one with Trump and told him he'd never be involved in the National Football League, right?
Yeah, it's just a joke. It's such a joke. I mean, it really, honestly, of all the things, it really drives me crazy because, I grew up in New York. It's just... It's hard not to get political with these things, so I'll allow myself for a minute. You may. We have open discourse around here, Pearlman. We can do anything but the 7 dirty words with Carlin, so watch that. Other than that, we're good. I'm just saying, I was in New York on 9/11. I'm a New Yorker. This guy's on TV bragging that he now has the tallest building on 9/11. This is a guy who, whether you're Democrat or Republican, spent 4 years insisting the sitting president of the United States was a Kenyan-born Muslim. This is a guy who said he saw people celebrating in New Jersey as the towers fell. This is a guy who donated $0.00 to 9/11 causes, who lied about being down at ground zero. Like, don't lecture me about patriotism. This is a guy who mocked a POW and said, he wasn't a hero because he was captured. Don't freaking get, how is this guy allowed to carry the mantle of patriotism in this country is beyond me, and it freaking infuriates me. And again, he's talking about the NFL and kneeling and blah, blah, blah. It's just a wedge issue for him and nothing more. During the USFL, when the anthem was being played, that guy sat there and did work while the anthem was being played. And I don't begrudge that at all. There have certainly been times when I was covering sports when the anthem was being played and I sat there doing work. But you don't see me lecturing everyone else about patriotism. It freaking drives me crazy. And the fact that anyone falls for that. If you like Trump's politics, I don't get it, but that's fine. But don't freaking tell me that this guy's some kind of patriot waving the flag and that we should be, how dare Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick has shown more patriotism and more restraint and more decency than I've ever seen from freaking Donald Trump. It just drives me crazy.
Football for a Buck is the book. It is Jeff Pearlman and the USFL, the crazy rise and the crazier demise. I've been waiting a long time for this book. I'm going to be fingering through this while we're on Trump, and then we'll back up and maybe get into some, some current talk here. But how did he get involved? Like, what? I'm sure your book goes through this, but what was the genesis of them wanting him in the league and him wanting to be in the league? Because he was literally a prime mover in that league, and a lot of people don't necessarily associate his work with the league. They probably associate it more with Herschel Walker or Doug Flutie or Steve Young or maybe the football players because no one's really familiar with the owners. I mean, I don't run into Chuck Fusina around here or, when you see Jim Mora, you probably think, beer commercial more than you think USFL. I don't know that it's top of mind, but Trump and USFL, he sort of kind of was the USFL or became that for a long period of time. But I don't know, it wasn't his vision to have this rival league, was it?
No, so in 1983 when the league started, he was an original owner, and at the last minute he backed out. Then in 1980, at the end of the 83 season, the New York team was being sold by a guy named Walter Duncan, and Trump bought in. And he was really into the idea. He talked a good game about how he loves spring football in the USFL. It's great. Then as soon as he gets a USFL franchise, we need to move to fall. And what gave Trump a lot of power in the USFL was in the ABC ESPN contract, the USFL was required to have a team in New York and a team in Chicago and a team in L.A. But the teams in Chicago and L.A. were falling apart, as was the team in Washington. So Trump, owning New York, put him in a very, very strong position because it was a franchise that needed to be owned in the league. So when he said we need to move to fall or I'm pulling out, owners felt sort of, like they were handcuffed. What are you going to do here? So he was just an owner of one of the teams, but he became the most powerful owner. And he also kind of just bullied the commissioner. I mean, he lied and lied and lied. He lied about he could get them a fall TV deal. He lied that he'd been talking with the networks and they were all really excited about it. And people believed him. I mean, you see it now. He's just one of his great strengths. It's diabolical, but you'd have to call it a strength. He is able to walk over people and convince people and sell people on things that you wouldn't normally be sold on.
Jeff Pearlman is here. It is Football for a Buck. We're telling stories here about Donald Trump and the USFL and the demise of the USFL. For anyone that wasn't around during this period of time in picking up the book, what's the sell for them? The sell for me is I know these names. I remember some of these stories. I mean, the sell for me is John Stedman coming in and telling me how bad Rick Neuheisel was as the quarterback of the Gunslingers. But for anybody that wasn't involved in this to know this history, the same way I wasn't around for the AFL, but I'm interested in it because I'm a football fan, there's football in here too, right?
Yeah, but here's my sell for you. To me, this is the big sell of the USFL book. There's a football player named Greg Fields. He was cut by the LA Express. He was a defensive lineman out of Grambling. Instead of just going off into the abyss, he punched his coach in the face. The LA Express, and then he starts calling in death threats to the team. The LA Express hires Liberace's security guard away from Liberace to protect the coach.
Who was the coach, by the way?
It was John Hadel.
Okay, John, former quarterback John Hadel. Okay.
Yeah, former quarterback. So, the guy's calling in death threats. Liberace's bodyguard is following him around. No one knows what to do. And then out of the blue, because the USFL is super weird, the San Antonio Gunslingers hire this guy, Greg Fields, because they need defensive line help. He goes to San Antonio. The owner, Clint Mangus, stops paying players. And one day he follows the owner home with a baseball bat and tells him if he doesn't get paid, there's going to be trouble. And the guy goes into his mansion and comes back out with $17,000 in cash. And Greg Fields is never seen again. Now, stories like that are just, they're just all over this book. They're just all over this book because they were all over the league. So If you want to read, if you love Terry Pluto, like Loose Balls was one of the best books of all time. Seasons in Hell, one of the best sports books of all time. I'm not saying this is one of the best sports books of all time. That'd be a little arrogant. But I feel like it's the craziest sports league that's ever existed, and it's just a million stories that you've never heard before.
And they're all true. Jeff Pearlman is here. You can follow him out on Twitter. What keeps you busy these days, bro? Like, I follow you, and I know you're sort of all over the place politically and stuff, and you did what I did for a long time, chasing athletes and running around. You don't necessarily do that anymore. But you're finding book stories, and I know of your passion for this because I've seen it borne out over the web over the last couple of years. What's going to fulfill you now? What's the next project for you, bro?
I really want to write a book about Tupac Shakur, the rapper.
But there's a Baltimore angle there, my brother.
I know, of course. And there's never been a great Tupac book. So my kind of dream book is Tupac. So I'm kind of putting together a proposal to see if that can happen.
All right. Well, good luck with that. I've always appreciated your work and your candor and your fight for the truth out there, Pearlman. So I appreciate you. Keep tweeting along. Get back out onto the sports beat from time to time, and hopefully you sell about 1 billion football for $1. And I hope everybody goes out to Amazon, their bookstore, and buys this thing because this is going to be a fun read for me on an airplane somewhere to Nashville or Los Angeles or some godforsaken place chasing a National Football League team. Jeff, thanks for waking up and doing it with us today. We appreciate it, pal.
All right, thanks for having me.
Jeff Pearlman, one of the great sports writers and sports journalists in the country. The book is brand new. It's fresh. It is Football for $1, The Crazy Rise and Crazier Demise of the USFL. I turn 50 next month, so the USFL and the Baltimore Stars and the Philadelphia Stars all in my wheelhouse, so I'm looking forward to fingering through this. I just picked the book up yesterday, so I'm glad to have it as well. You can find me out on the buyatoyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world you happen to be. Our morning newspaper ships to your email inbox free of charge each and every morning. It's all brought to you by our friends at Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com. They're doing a great event next month, the John W. Brick Foundation for Mental Health Awareness and Healing. They're bringing Wim Hof in. They're doing an Iceman demonstration on October the 13th and 14th. You can learn more at JWB 5K. That's John W. Brick 5K, and that's being held up at Timonium on my 50th birthday, October 14th, so we won't forget that. I'll be in Nashville, but I'll be running in my mind along with the 5Kers out there. Also brought to you by our friends at the Maryland Jockey Club and Laurel Park. They're racing this week. The DeFrancis Dash postponed, now coming this weekend, and of course the Maryland Million coming your way on October 20th. Go to the front of WNST.net as well as our morning newspaper for all the Laurel stuff. Last but never least, any breaking news happens first on the WNST Tech Service. That's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard, and Dennis Colatzos will be here on Thursday from 3 until 5, driving you home, getting you ready for football this weekend. I am Nestor. I am a very available individual. Nasty at WNST.net reaches me. Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, anywhere books are sold. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.